that the cause of the fire was in fact due to welders working at the rear of the building.
More than a week later, we now know what caused the fire that killed Lieutenant Walsh, firefighter Kennedy in the Back Bay. The police commissioner says they are still looking at the possibility of any criminal charges.
Absolutely. Fire investigators telling us today that sparks from a welding operation next door, that's what started the fire on Beacon Street last Wednesday. Police say the fire was not intentional. That's important, but they've not decided if anybody will face charges. It does not appear as though the welders had a permit for that work, and there was no fire detail on the job. Heavy wind that day forced the fire to spread quickly, leading to that 9-alarm blaze that caused the deaths of Lieutenant Ed Walsh and firefighter Michael Kennedy.
Lots of questions, of course. Here to help answer them is Amy Cronin. She is the president of Strategic Code Solutions, and you are an expert in things like regulations, including codes, standards, and were with the National Fire Protection Association, by the way, for 17 years. I mean, based on the preliminary reports that we have here, what are you gleaning from those reports?
Well, the hazards of welding are really well known, and as such, you've got regulations, you've got national regulations, you've got state, you've got local, you've got NFPA. OSHA covers it, the Massachusetts Fire Prevention Code, as well as the Boston Fire Code. NFPA has 51B, and basically all those regulations have the same basic tenets in it that were violated, the first of which was being too close to combustibles. Anything closer than 35 feet is a hazard, and interestingly, NFPA specifically warns that if you are on an elevated, if you're at an elevation, the sparks and slag can travel even further, so it could be more of a hazard. Also, NFPA says be careful of windy conditions. It can carry the spark and slag. So, I mean, it's been warned. These are hazards that are really well known. Yeah. Because it's so hazardous, you have to do a permit, you have to do a fire watch, and none of those things appear at this time to have been done.
Yeah, permits are required for all welding projects, correct? And in Massachusetts, and apparently no permit was pulled here, but the question is, was one absolutely needed? Sounds like it was.
In the city of Boston, it's absolutely required for any welding to have a permit pulled. Now, every jurisdiction is slightly different. So, you know, if you're doing welding in a different jurisdiction, you're going to want to check. But with these conditions where it's at an elevation, it's outside, there are potential combustibles, you absolutely need a permit.
It's worth mentioning how old this building was.
Well, and also the wood that's part of these brick structures, there's quite a bit of wood, which is really a tinderbox because that wood has been around for decades in some cases and is very dry.
Absolutely. And another well-known hazard is that there can be sparks and slag that get trapped in concealed spaces. Like in this situation, they theorized that it was in the clapboard or, you know, so it sat and smoldered. And we are just really lucky that the fire could have been even more tragic if it had smoldered for a few more hours and until people were asleep.
Yeah, it sounds like these welders had absolutely no idea that the sparks were in fact smoldering. It sounds like they didn't know.
That's frequent that occurs, and that's the reason for a permit, that's the reason for a fire watch, that's the reason you follow all these procedures.
And let's talk about that fire watch. It would seem, given the winds that we had that day, and remember Kevin Lemanowitz telling us, gusts of 50 miles an hour, you're in the back of the building, so you're open to the Charles, so the wind's going across the Charles, across into the back of that building, and not taking the steps to have a fire detail there to make sure it is without incident.
It seems just unfathomable after the fact. And you know, all those factors, there are so many other factors. Anytime you're at an elevation, anytime there are combustibles, you really need a fire watch. And if you're at an elevated area, you want one not only where you are, but also below and anywhere else that the sparks and slag could travel. So you might have even needed more than one fire watch on that particular situation.
So Amy, you know, we've had an emotional week here in Boston. We've seen 2 firefighters laid to rest. Today, the cause of this fire comes out. Do you think anybody will be charged in this case? That's, we should mention, being left up to the Suffolk County District Attorney's Office.
Of course, none of us can know, but what I can say with certainty is, assuming the welders were under the jurisdiction of OSHA, and there's several factors to that, they absolutely violated OSHA, so I would expect at a minimum that OSHA would open an investigation just to even see if, you know, if there should be charges there. But everything else, we're all waiting to hear about that.
Well, perhaps some more light can be shed here. I understand we just got this, so we want to brief you on this as well as our audience. But we are told the company has released a statement. The company that owns 296 Beacon sent us this statement. The company recently contracted with a third party to install safety railings at 296 Beacon Street. It was the company's understanding that these railings would be prefabricated off-site. That statement is from Oliver Realty Limited Partnership. So you've heard that now. We're talking about railings, so obviously you're moving at some point potentially in elevation. But they're saying that this should have been work done off-site and not on-site as it was.
Well, I can't really speak to it, but it seems even if they're prefabricated, they still have to attach them to the building. And so some, hot
Might have
worker
required
welding
welding at that point.
would need to be done.
And judging by just the weather conditions that day, I was down there that day. I mean, the wind coming off the Charles was unbelievable, those gusts. And just, you would think that that would at some point play a role, be some sort of a factor in the decision to do this on site. You would think that.
Absolutely.
I mean, if nothing else, maybe that was just a decision that should have been made. I mean, I don't know. Maybe that's more something that OSHA would have to deal with.
If the permit was pulled, the fire department would have taken those factors all into consideration, and perhaps we wouldn't have had this tragedy.
Well, let's talk about the permits just real quickly, because we know that there are people who do work, maybe not on this particular job, but maybe in other areas of the Commonwealth, who may say, oh, it takes time, it costs money, it has to be inspected. Well, let's just get somebody to do it. And we're not saying that happened here, but that is a good rule of thumb, that you pull a permit for a reason.
Right. And if you are a hot work operator or welder, you absolutely know the hazards. There are NFPA data reports, the torch report, that between 2006 and 2010, there were over 5,000 fires attributed to welding. Over 10 deaths a year are attributed to these fires, 210 civilian injuries. That's not even taken into account the firefighters that may be injured or, fatalities as a result of these welding fires. So it's an absolute tragedy that this happened with such a well-known hazard.
If you're a homeowner out there and you want some work done on your property, is it you who has to make sure that the workers have pulled the permits? Do you have to pull? How does that all work for people?
It's different in every single jurisdiction, but in most cases it's going to be the contractor that pulls the permit. But if I'm a homeowner, I'm absolutely going to be talking to my local fire department, my local jurisdiction, to really ask them what is necessary and to really talk about what are the safeguards. And although you want to feel like you can trust your contractor, you want to trust but be smart about it. So I would absolutely just look into it, see where they're doing work. Are there combustibles around? Do they have a permit? Do they really seem to know what they're doing? And that's really important.
Very good advice. And Amy Cronin is the president of Strategic Code Solutions. We appreciate your insight as well. And
Thank
I know
you.
your husband himself, a firefighter.
He's a firefighter, that's right.
So this is very close to you.
home.
Sure does.
Definitely.
Thank you for joining us
Thank you.
again. All right, I want to pass along some more information now. The firm that owns 296 Beacon also owns multiple dwellings and buildings in the Back Bay, and we'll have more on that coming up at 6 o'clock right now.